So I grew up in the southern suburbs of Chicago. You know, at the time, I would have described it as very diverse. And so it probably wasn't until, I don't know, high school, where the fact that I was on the dance team, but I was also in AP classes, was something worth mentioning, particularly for counselors, as an anomaly, as an odd thing that an African American dancing girl was also in the AP classes. And it probably wasn't until I started talking about being an engineering major that I really could see both a black engineer, a black female engineer. I don't think so. I don't think that that's gonna be where you're gonna go. And fortunately, I had parents and I had a cousin who was an engineer that said, hey, we're gonna keep moving and we're not gonna let these voices that say that's not what you should do, or that hasn't been done, or that's gonna be hard, who's gonna hire you. That was probably my first kind of really intense view, I guess, of how race could be tough. In high school, my very best friend was Jewish, and her stepfather was a pretty racist dude. And we just made a pact that we just never hung out at her house. And he was mean, and I just hadn't really experienced a lot of that in my life. But my parents were very clear, we just don't spend time with those people. He is easy to avoid. But it was always, for me growing up, a little bit more subtle. Right? He wasn't particularly subtle, but I didn't have to spend a lot of time with him. Or I remember a good friend of mine, her parents would make comments about, well, you know, you don't want to be at Stephanie's house too late, or she's having her family over. Okay, are you sure you want to be there because she's white, and how would she feel being in a house full of African American people? And the reality was, she was one of my closest friends. She would have felt fine, but her parents were uncomfortable, and it reminded me how other people's issues, you can make that the issues of your children, of your neighbors, as opposed to giving them really an opportunity to form their own conclusions. And even now, as an adult, you know, people will say, you know, well, I don't know how I'd feel if I was in a room full of African Americans. And I'm thinking to myself, do you not know how you feel? Ask me how I feel being in a room full of white people, because I do it every day, and I've done it every day for 20, 30 years. I'm an engineer. And so I often ask people, if you don't know what it feels like, there's lots of people to ask. You survive, it's okay. But part of what you have to do, and I think especially in areas or for people who have grown up in very homogeneous environments, a lot of time, no fault of your own, you just don't know. You haven't been around people who are different. They're not in your community, they're not at your school, and you don't really get that diversity until you go to work. But what I say to them is, then you have to take the responsibility of knowing that how you perceive other races, other ethnicities, is through stories or through TV. And TV is for entertainment purposes only, right? Like, every white person on TV does not represent every white person, you know what I mean? So I think it's just important for people to think about that when they're in those environments, that, you know, some of us have had to work through that every single day. And so I think there's a resilience that comes from being a minority that you can either take as a superpower, or it can wear you down. For me now, while I am still doing work, I really like that I get to spend more time in the community with the girls. In our family, we talk a lot about planting seeds. And so a lot of what James and I do in Edina is about planting seeds of change that we may not experience. We may not see the benefits, but our girls will, and their kids will, and your kids will, and the neighbors' kids. And that, to me, is the most important thing. Our ability to make meaningful change in the community. Minneapolis, Minnesota is filled with all these great companies, and a lot of people come here. And I think two things have to happen. The business community has to come together, and I think that they are, and really thinking about how do we make Minneapolis the most inclusive place it can be. Because from a competitive advantage, you're gonna need to do that, because top talent is looking a lot different today than it did 20, 30 years ago. And so if the business community does their part, then the communities have to do their part too. Because when James and Stephanie Pierce move here to work at Cargill at General Mills, that's great if from 8 to 5 we have this wonderful inclusive experience, but then we come into our communities where we feel very isolated, that's tough. And so I think if communities can find ways to leverage this kind of business bringing all these people in, and then communities finding ways to get people to feel more comfortable being together, and that comfort comes from knowing, from meeting somebody that you can say, I didn't know that she would be like that. That's kind of cool. She's kind of just like me. We're talking about the same things. What I'm gonna sign my kid up for summer. How come that has to be at 8 o'clock in the morning? Why at 8:05 was it already full? I mean, we're having the same conversations. And I think if our communities can spend more time doing that, kind of building that awareness and that comfort, we will do great things here in the Twin Cities. I spent a lot of time with CEOs and leaders of companies, and one of the things I said to them is, you're all asking the same question, literally. How do I hire and retain more people of color? What are the things that we need to be thinking about from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective within our organization? You're all asking the same things. So if you could come together and just think about something like recruiting, how can we as a business community, especially the bigger companies, how can we kind of come together and have one compelling story? How can we come together and get better at understanding where our own biases come from and what are the unconscious things that are happening in our processes in our organization? If they do that, then you can go off and find your own special, unique story. But if they do that, then the small and mid-sized companies, when we're bringing, all these big companies are bringing these people in, they can be doing the same thing. But now we've got communities, now they're kind of working together. Our family has felt very blessed here. We have wonderful friends. We have met all kinds of great people. Our kids are having great experiences. We have a story to tell. It doesn't mean that we haven't had some not so great things happen, because we have. But what has been great for me is that I have a community of women that I can go and tell the story, and they're like, we're gonna figure out a way to make sure that doesn't happen again. Because the more they know, the more outraged they become, and the more interested they are in making change for themselves, for their kids, and for their kids' kids. So a really great friend of mine, her daughter and my youngest are besties, and they've been besties for 5 years, so they're kindergarten to today. She is an avid social media person, right? So she's always looking at Pinterest, and she sees all these things. And one of the things that she saw, there was a 9-year-old girl who had started this little business, and the business was all about these crayons. So she had a box of crayons that were just the rainbow. But then she had another box that was multicultural crayons. And the essence of these crayons is that it represented all the different skin colors. So as opposed to in the Crayola box, there just being a pink or a flesh color that's like a peachish color, you had all these different shades, and it was in a separate box. So she got this for me. She was like, hey, I think this is awesome. I want to support this little girl's business, but I love what she's doing. And this is the part that I think is really important. Not only did she get one of those for me, but she's white. She got one for her daughter as well. And I think, again, what that shows is it's not just important for Stephanie to have multicultural crayons because she is African American and her daughter is African American. But my daughter might want to draw some people who aren't flesh colored AKA pink or peach, but are flesh colored a la burnt sienna, chocolate, you know, some other color. And that to me was huge. Like her ability to say, this is not just important for Stephanie, this is also important for my daughter to understand that flesh color is not just one color. Flesh color is a variety of colors. And so I think it's just important for people to think about that. I think about that when, you know, I take my daughter to dance and they say she needs pink tights. And I'm like, does she need pink tights or does she need flesh color tights? And almost always they'll come back and say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, we meant flesh color tights. And so it's those little things. And I say to them, that doesn't make you a racist, right? So, because you can see that people are like, oh my God. I'm like, no, these are all the learnings that we're all taking in, right? I'm taking it in, you're taking it in, we're all learning together. And I think that's the important thing, is that we take this journey as a journey for all of us, where everybody has something that they're learning, something that they're sharing, ways that they're growing.